believe that leadership isn't a position or a role, it's an action and a choice. I believe that leadership can be learned. I believe that great leaders emerge from adversity. I believe that Happy Valley is full of great leaders. These are their stories. Welcome to the Happy Valley Leaders Podcast. Today I've got with me Candy Yekel. She's the Associate Vice President for Research at Penn State and the Director of Research Protections. Welcome, Candy.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you got to Penn State.
Yeah, so you're right. My title is Associate Vice President for Research and Director of the Office of Research Protections. And I've been with Penn State now in various capacities for about 27 years. Started actually as a student, so even longer if you count those years. But I'm going to back up a little bit because, I started as a returning adult student at Fayette campus back in like 1985. And first in my family to go to college. And even, it was just kind of backwards in doing it. I was married soon after high school, had my daughter. The marriage unfortunately didn't last. And I was 25 and had a high school education. My parents were farmers and future was bleak for me. I knew that. And so it was important to decide what to do, how to support my daughter, myself. Farming wasn't really my thing. So I always wanted to go to college. I just didn't know how to do it. We just didn't have that in our family. My grandmother was from Croatia, and she didn't know how to do it. My mother, that just wasn't in our background. Mm-hmm. So I went to Fayette campus, met a woman by the name of Betsy Baird. She was a guidance counselor at the time, and spent the afternoon with her. Left there with mounds of paper. At the time, they used to give these one-page fact sheets about music, art, psychology, whatever. And my interests were A to Z. Left there, went to a friend's house, and at the time, so this was the mid-'80s, and at the time, the coal mines, which was big where I lived, were hiring women. So there was this movement to start to employ women because it was predominantly men prior to that. And I was a young, strong woman working on a farm, right? A friend of mine who was able to get a job in the mines, and in those days, those were good paying jobs. It was $100 a day at the time. And she said, I can get you in. So I was debating, do I take the $100 a day in hand, or do I, take a risk and do something completely unknown to me where I was worried about how would I manage it. So I took the risk, and here I am. So I want to share that only because I think that for me, coming to Penn State, it was a different kind of path. And as a student, sort of growing up here, and then I was fortunate to get the job while I was finishing my graduate work in the then compliance office. And since then, I've been working my way up through administrative ranks.
Wow. I love it. It's a great American story as well as a Penn State story, and starting at a campus first out of your generation. Same way for me. I was the first from my family to graduate from college. But now you went from an undergrad degree at Penn State to then graduate study. So how did you make that transition from not sure if you could do college, and now you must have done pretty well and then felt comfortable to take graduate courses?
Yeah. It was sort of a seamless transition in a way. Now, at the time, I'm sure I was just dying. But looking back on it, the path was clear. And I had, starting at Fayette campus, there were 13 returning adults. So now there's lots of returning adults, right? The population and the makeup of the student population is quite diverse. Then, it was traditional folks coming out of high school, going right to college. Sure. My peer class was graduating, gone. They were out the door. They were starting their professional lives. So there were 13 of us, and we were called, I can't remember the name, maybe Returning Lions or something like that. Betsy had a club. Interestingly, I was the only one who graduated out of the 13. So that's how challenging for returning adults, and there were men and women, either having to start their careers over, or maybe for some life event change they needed to rethink it. But I don't think at that time there were systems to really support returning adults who face other challenges rather than just being a student. But nonetheless, I was a fortunate one. I did develop some really great support with faculty who were there, who really supported me. My family, obviously, they wanted me to be successful. They were really excited for me. And I was lucky, starting FA campus was a good place for me because my family was there. So I did that year there. Then I moved to University Park. Still had my daughter in tow. So those challenges were there. And, but there was something seamless to it. And I can't quite explain how that happened. I have talked about it. I've talked about it at returning adult conferences. I had the opportunity to do a speaking engagement at one of their conferences, and a presentation about how to encourage students and returning adults in particular to sort of stay the course and try to find that one moment in time where you grab onto it and go where it takes you. But it's like taking chances and giving it the best shot you have and not giving up, even if, because nothing was perfect. I mean, I had to rethink things all along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've touched on this a little bit, but talk a little bit about how adversity in your life has kind of formed you into the leader that you are today.
Yeah. So, I think adversity is really important for leadership. And I think when leaders face adversity, that's when you see who the leaders are. They stand up. They don't duck and cover. They stand up. And again, it's not that a leader is going to be perfect every time. It's not about that. It's about the leader stands up and takes on the challenges, shows the way. It shouldn't be, duck and cover. It should be standing up, understanding what you need to do, facing the challenges, and working through them. And I think that for me personally, there's been adversity. It's not always roses. It's challenges and adversity along the way in my personal life, in my professional life. And even at a very early age for me, I was that kid that was willing to take challenges. I can give you an example of this. Back in December of 1973, my county where I lived got a terrible ice storm, and the entire county went dark. And we lived on a farm, and I could see the next closest town to us, and it looked like it was blowing up, and I was terrified as a child. But what was happening is transformers and generators were blowing from the ice. I didn't understand that at the time. Sure. And we were without power for weeks. And we were fortunate, again, the farmers, because we had a coal furnace and wood stoves and things like that. We were fine, but there were plenty of people who were not. I called the governor's office and was fortunate to talk to the lieutenant governor. Actually, my mother was watching this whole thing and advocating for help. And because people were really concerned we weren't getting help, and people were hungry and cold. And it's just an example. I was that kid. The adversity did not sway me in taking on a challenge and trying to make a difference.
Wow. Was there anything, do you think, that was born into you? Were there some experiences that you had or people that influenced you when you were younger that made you that person that was, when they saw a problem, didn't shy away and in fact embraced the situation and became a leader?
Well, I do think there are some traits that are born into us that help us become leaders. I think anybody can be a leader, and I encourage people to be leaders. We should all use and embrace those skills when we need to. I do think there are some folks who have some natural tendencies, or like I said, traits or characteristics that lends themselves to maybe being that leader sooner. For me, I think that my life, I mean, we were not wealthy farmers. We were poor farmers, and I was the oldest of 5. So I think almost by necessity, I was sort of forced into that role. My mother was not well early on in her life. And so I had to assume kind of that role as the mom, which moms have to be leaders too of their little family unit.
Absolutely.
And it was always kind of that way. And then again, as somebody coming to college as a single mom, I needed to, again, I'm going to use the term stand up, and sort of take some responsibility. So I think there's innate characteristics that help lens, or helps to produce leaders, but I think we all can do it. We can all learn. And certainly over the course of my career, I have learned to be a better leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And totally agree with you that I think each of us has certain skills that, there's not one skill that is leadership, right? It's a matter of harnessing some of these different inherent things, but then to your point, building on that, enhancing that, and then filling in the areas that maybe we're not as strong in, either by building on them through our own development or surrounding ourselves with people who maybe complement our leadership.
Right.
So you mentioned, I think Betsy at Fayette campus. Are there other people that you look back that were kind of critical to your development as a leader and kind of help make you the leader that you are today?
Yeah, I think there's been several along the way. And again, I keep focusing on this early development for me, but that was critical for me. My grandmother was really important in that role. Again, her mother came to this country with her husband and their children. My grandmother was actually born in this country, but all of her siblings were born in Croatia, or the then Yugoslavia. And my grandmother, I can tell you, she said it once, she said it 1,000 times. You come from good stock. And what she meant by that when she would talk about it is, she said, your grandmother, even though she would have been my great grandmother, she still referred to her as my grandmother. My grandmother traveled a long way to come here to give us a better life. And she had a backbone. And she would say, that backbone's in you too. You need to stand up, and you have good stock. Take charge of your life, make a difference. And she said that, I can't even tell you how often she said that to me. It was almost like it was ingrained in me to do these things. So I felt a lot of responsibility, sometimes burden, to live up to those expectations. I played sports, so I had a really great coach who was instrumental, then in my teen years. And then as I moved into those college years, I had people who just took an interest in my success and my journey. And they sort of, I don't know if they were leaders that I would say that I looked up to, but they were certainly people that I respected and who cared about me to kind of nurture me along that journey.
That's great. Yeah, clearly people, I love that your grandmother instilled that in you, right? So, and that repetition, and there's no way you could avoid that, right? That you had to believe that because you heard it so much.
That's right.
And I would venture to say that the people who helped you along the way probably saw that in you, right? They saw that belief that you had in yourself, and clearly some natural leadership tendencies. And even if you didn't believe it, they probably believed that it was in you. Does that influence at all how you, as you think about leaders that you're bringing along? You have a large organization now, and you have leaders that work for you. How does that, in the mentorship you've received, how does that influence how you lead others?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And just thinking about doing this podcast with you today, I talked to a former employee who no longer works under my organization, but still within the university. And I felt that she would give me an honest critique. It's not something you think about. I think about supervising, managing, leading. I think about my responsibilities, but I don't think about sort of the philosophy behind it, if you will.
Right.
I think about how do I do something better if I didn't do a great job on something, or I felt that I could have done better. What could I have changed, next time? So I talked to her a little bit, and it was really interesting. It's uncomfortable in a sense to have somebody talk to you about your leadership style or what works, what doesn't. But it felt good. So it was a positive experience. And the one thing that she said to me, and I believe this to be true, and I would have said this about myself, is that when you hire folks, like you're, and I'm not as involved intimately with hiring staff these days as I used to be, but you're looking for certain things, right? Yes, they need to have the skills and the experiences to do the job, but then there's that kind of X factor, right? What is that one thing? And I think that I have done a good job in my career finding that X factor in folks, and then sort of helping nurture that talent. And when I think about it, that's what happened to me in my young life too, right? It's that something that you can't quite say, oh, it's, you know, it's this, it's your brown eyes candy. No, it's not my brown eyes, it's something else, right? And what this particular individual said, that there's it's charismatic when you have a leader look at you and know that they can help develop you, and when that development's occurring, there's almost like this charismatic interaction that's occurring because you're feeding off of one another in a sense, and you're, you know, it's exciting for me as a more senior person now, seeing the you know, sort of the seeds take root and flourish. And it says, you know, it says a lot about the person because they're doing all the hard work, right? They're the ones who are in there really taking the chances, really, you know, doing that self-reflection and saying, how do I grow as a professional? But as a person who is there sort of nurturing and tending the garden, if you will, and seeing it, it's so rewarding, and it is a reflection of you. And so sometimes it doesn't always work, right? That I can't say that I've been like hitting it out of the park all the time, but even in those cases, when things don't work out as well, that's also a reflection of me, or at least I accept it as a reflection of me. And those are the times I look to say, what could I have done better? Or how could I have made this interaction more productive for everyone?
I love the garden analogy. And maybe that's fitting with your farming roots,
Maybe.
right? But planting those seeds and there's tending that you're doing, especially as it's a young plant, right? And you're pulling out the weeds that you see, and you're adding the fertilizer and nourishing it. I mean, the plant's doing the growing, but you're trying to give it the best possible chance of success.
Correct.
And so I think that's a great analogy. And then I really liked how you talked about the self-reflection when things don't work out. If there's no way to grow as a leader if you're not thinking about how to get better. And even if you're not thinking of it in leadership terms, you're thinking about, well, this plant didn't grow as well. What could I have done better?
Right.
There's a certain humility to that says, I didn't do as well as I could. What are the things that I can do to affect the outcome next time, as opposed to what was wrong with this plant, right? It was the plant's fault, right? So I love that. You know, Candy, you so in my observations and working with you in the past is you deal with a lot of varied stakeholders, right? So you deal with executives, you do, you know, compliance cases that can be very sensitive or high visibility. You're dealing with faculty members, and you deal with different types of faculty members. So you deal with social science researchers who are very different than, say, medical doctors at the College of Medicine, now that you have responsibility for human subjects research across, you know, the whole research enterprise of Penn State. Can you talk about how leadership in the dealing with those different groups, how leadership may be, and then you have your own staff, obviously, who are staff members, and that's another kind of group that you deal with. Does your leadership change with those different groups? What's the same? What's different? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start first with the things that I think are consistent across all of those interactions. I think it's really important to have integrity in every conversation. And I think it's important to have mutual respect for one another, professionalism. So some of those basic elements, which I'm going to say should be for everyone, treating people with kindness, respect, you know, how you want to be treated. I think that's a given across the board. So it doesn't matter to me if I'm talking with a student, with a faculty member, with a surgeon, with a staff member, with a community member. That basic dignity, respect, integrity, truthfulness is across the board. I think in challenging situations, and again, much doesn't matter who the people are, but the situations sometimes dictate that, you have to sort of set up the ground rules, and people don't always come to the table wanting to be respectful or talk about solutions or negotiate outcomes. Sometimes people will come in and say, I want A, and this group will say, I want B, and nobody wants to compromise. It's really important to find a compromise. And, do we always get what we want? No, but there are standards we have to meet, and how we get there might change, but we got to get to this standard. Those situations are difficult regardless, like I said, of who's there, whether it's students, faculty, staff, people from the College of Medicine, or social scientists. The way we get there can be dictated by the situation and how inflamed it might be. And I think that's where, for somebody like me who might be negotiating those outcomes or responsible to get us to an outcome, it's really important for me to be the constant in the room. And that's how I viewed it throughout my career. That, do I ever feel like maybe I'm starting to feel stressed out? Oh yeah, I definitely do. But I work really hard to make sure that I stay constant, to sort of be that arbitrator, the negotiator that brings us to an outcome. And that's worked well for me. Again, not always 100%. I can tell you, David, without a doubt, throughout my career, nothing has been 100%. These absolutes don't exist. But I do strive. That's my goal in every situation.
Yeah. I really liked what you said about integrity. I came out of kind of a military leadership tradition, having spent time in the Air Force, and our core values were integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. And like, I can still recite those, they're clear in my mind. And the integrity first was first for a reason, because the minute a leader loses that, they've lost everything, whether they realize it or not. The minute the people trying to follow don't have respect for that person, they'll, no matter, regardless of how well their performance is in all other areas of leadership, they will fail. That's natural. That's just going to happen. So I love that part of it.
And I couldn't agree more. I think when integrity's gone, it's not going to be a good outcome. And it's like there's it's a piece of your soul kind of missing, if you will. And, I was thinking about something that Eva Pell was my supervisor. She was the vice president for search. And gosh, I can't remember how long ago now she's retired, but at least a dozen years, maybe more. She and I would have these conversations, and we would talk about compliance, and that's been my whole professional career, dealing with compliance at some level. And there's different approaches to maintaining a good compliance program. Some people will, kind of do the muscle strong arm. You do it because I say so. It's not my style. And I, frankly, as a leader in this area, I think that's absolutely the wrong way to do it. I think compliance has to be more service-minded. We have to instill a sense of this concern that we are doing these things not because we have to, but because it's the right thing to do. And that comes back to the integrity. It's the right thing to do. And if I had my career and I was doing it because you have to, trying to tell researchers you have to do this, I frankly don't think I would have been as successful as I have been. And I think it's more about having a conversation and explaining why we're doing it. It's the right thing to do.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I mean, I think it speaks to understanding your audience and who you're dealing with. But like you said, back to the integrity of understanding the why behind what we're trying to do. So people will respond generally. Good people will respond if they understand the why, even if they don't like what they're being asked to do. If they understand the why and believe in it, 9 times out of 10, good people will just say, okay, I accept that, even if they don't like it.
And they at least can respect it,
Right. Yeah. And I think, and to your point, you've built a career around compliance. You're a nationally respected leader in this space, and that comes from understanding how to do compliance at a university, how that fits in the bigger picture of what the university is trying to achieve, and then at the human level of, to your point about respecting people and their dignity and integrity, you wouldn't have had as many years of success as you did without that, right? That's the foundation that then all of that builds on. I mean, and it's interesting how has your staff grown from when you started in compliance and started managing? You outgrew a building. If it wasn't for remote work, I think we'd be looking for more office space for you, right?
I mean, yeah. So yeah, that's an interesting story. It's funny because I met with some new staff yesterday, and I really should get these numbers, so I'm going to be able to give you some ballpark numbers. But one of my things that I say when I meet new staff is I kind of give them a little bit of history of the Office of Research Protections, which has grown dramatically in the time that I've been there. So when I was hired as a compliance coordinator, and I did oversee the office, but it was an office of 4 people. And 2 of the 4, I was one of the 4, but 2 of the 4 were part-time temporary staff.
Wow.
And we had 4 areas of responsibility. Fast forwarded to today, we have 14 areas of responsibility, so 14 different programs, and that's growing. And the world of compliance has grown. Penn State's not unique. This is everywhere. And we went from those 4 part-time temporary people to over 50. I don't know the exact number, but because we've hired recently, so over 50 full-time permanent employees, and we're still hiring.
Wow.
To keep up with the program growth. So it's grown. I would have not thought, frankly, I thought I was only going to be here for a couple of years and move on. I mean, my plan was to get a tenured faculty position somewhere doing research. And my career made a complete U-turn, and I did something else. I would not have expected to still be here after a few years, but I've made a career, and it's been a good career for me. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, and tremendously successful for the university to continue to invest in your organization time and time again. And I'm sure there were plenty of opportunities where other universities would have been interested in stealing you away, and yet you continued to stay here. As you reflect back on that kind of growth and in your organization and your responsibility, can you reflect a little bit on your growth as a leader? I mean, are there ways that you lead now that are different than when you started the office all those years ago?
Oh gosh, yeah. There's ways I lead today that's different from how I led a year ago. Starting out, again, I think I had some natural leadership skills, and even in graduate school, I was the graduate student coordinator for the developmental students, so I had responsibilities there. And I didn't realize, frankly, even what I was getting myself into, if the truth be told. After I left the interview for the position, I went back to my advisor, who happened to be the department head of psychology. And I said, well, I'm not getting that job because I didn't even know what I was applying for. I thought I was going to be somebody's assistant, and here I was going to be the person running that office. So I thought, well, I blew that. But 2 weeks later, they offered me the job. So there you go. So when I went into it, I again, little naive, right? I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I knew that I'm a good worker. I work hard, I do my homework, very responsible in that way. So I thought, I'll figure it out. And, research integrity officers were being, starting to make an impact. And the then Vice President, David Shirley, asked me to serve as his research integrity officer. He said, but I don't know if you need to do anything, because nobody really knew what was going on anyway at the time. It was brand new. And I went to a conference in Chicago with other Big Ten research integrity officers. And I sat there and I was like a deer in headlights. I was like, wow, I am way over my head. This is beyond me. So I had to come back and really sort of reinvent myself. But the problem was, when you're asking about leadership, it was my first real job in a professional environment where I was in charge of others. Mm-hmm. And I really had no formal training. So I was on the job training. So I made lots of mistakes. lots of mistakes where, people in the office might not have been agreeing with one another. They were frustrated, normal sort of people get along situation. I was young. And so I botched up a few things, but I think what the difference is when you go home at night, you think, wow, what could I have done better? Like, if this happens again, what am I going to do? Started taking some university classes because they have Penn State leaders. I took some of those things to learn more about it. Also, I should mention, in graduate school, my minor emphasis was on organizational and industrial psychology, and I took leadership classes there. So I had some framework what a leader should look like. And I just started like more deliberately thinking about instead of reacting, I started to think much more strategically when I was presented with issues that required leadership. And instead of reacting and saying, okay, yeah, let's do this, I was like, I need to think about that. And then I had a plan, and I was calm, cool, collected. So those were things I learned early on that I continued to build upon, and even to this day, continue to build upon. I'm still growing as a leader and getting, I hope, better and stronger as a leader. Recently had challenges, when the decision was made that I would have responsibility for the human subjects program at the College of Medicine. That presented some serious challenges because, I'm here in University Park, that's 90 miles away. I made a commitment that it was going to be me who would face and carry this burden, not my staff. So, made arrangements to travel there, and I really had to listen, like really listen. And not that I hadn't done listening before that, but maybe not as much in the details of things as I was going to have to do in this particular thing. So I had to kind of adjust my leadership style a little bit and think about what was important for this particular situation, for us to get this situation stabilized and to be able to build upon a stable environment instead of what was there at the moment was a little bit of chaos, a lot of insecurity, a lot of fears of what was happening. So there were things that I hadn't had to deal with in the past, or at least in the recent past, of trying to stabilize a unit and to introduce myself to folks who, were feeling a lot of emotion and saying, look, give me a chance and I'll earn your respect. And I had to be there. So I had to take on some personal responsibility for being there and allowing them to tell me all of the details before we did anything. So I think it's we evolve and we have to do it. And anytime I think a leader gets stagnant, I think maybe that's the end. Maybe that's it. But I think leaders have to evolve continuously.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting as you were describing that, talking about how you adapted your leadership to that situation, right? So when you're used to having your staff deal with details, which is very normal as you get higher and higher within the management chain, but you went down into the details, right? And
yes.
And you personally went there with those people to make that connection with them. You saw the value of that.
Yes.
That's again kind of the humility and also the adapting to the situation that you're dealing with and what's needed at that moment, and not saying I'm above that now. I think that's great. I really like that story. So Candy, I know that you talk about not being necessarily a student of leadership in the way of intellectually studying it like a college course, but you live it clearly. Is there anything that as you reflect on the ways that you develop yourself professionally, that you think helps you become a better leader? So any books that you read or podcasts, or how do you kind of continue to nurture your leadership qualities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't participated in podcasts, although I'll say if I see an interesting TED Talk, I'll watch those things. I don't participate in any kind of regular podcast at this point. I read a book recently. I read a book recently, which was interesting. It was called Leadership by John Maxwell. And it actually was a good book to read because it talked about, he's all about perks and price. And the theme throughout the book was thinking about perks. So leaders who look at the perks versus the price. He suggests that we should look at the price versus the perks, because if you do well in whatever it is your goals are, what you're trying to achieve, the perks come naturally. You shouldn't be thinking about them. But there are plenty of leaders who do think about, what is it for me? What will I get out of it? What will the organization get out of it? Versus, what's this going to cost my team? What's it going to cost me? What's it going to cost the organization? And then kind of making those judgments. So there are some good books to read. I think that for me, throughout my career, I've taken different, like I said, early on in my career, I took some of those classes on my own, workshops through, human resources. And in fact, at one point, even for my entire staff, we brought in finding the Penn State leader in you. So all of us took it together, trying to promote again within the staff. Find the leader in yourself, take some initiative, take responsibility, be responsible. So those sorts of things I've done. And I wouldn't be opposed to doing more of those. I think, David, to answer your question, though, the most important thing for me, what I've done in my career that I would suggest others would consider, look for opportunities to lead. Take opportunities to lead, volunteer to do those things. I'm a big believer in people taking opportunities. There have been things like speaking engagements, for example. I do them. I'm much better at them now than I used to be, more comfortable with them. I even look forward to doing them. But early on, I was terrified, especially at the national level. And we have an organization that accredits human subjects programs. And I wanted to be part of it. But I was a little hesitant. One, I was worried about time, but two, I was thinking, like, am I really ready for something like that? Do I have something to contribute? Do I have anything that's of value? And I forced myself to do it, even though my nature was, I wasn't keen on it. I felt like I had a lot to do at home, at Penn State. But I forced myself to do it. And I'm so glad I did, because it added a new dimension to my leadership. It added a dimension that was more national, that I was able to see that, yeah, I do have something to contribute beyond here at Penn State. And that was a huge step for me. And I think those are the things that I continue to do, that I would encourage young leaders or folks who are saying, how can I be a leader? Look for opportunity and take it. And you don't worry about whether you're successful or not. Just keep doing it, and then evaluate yourself fairly afterwards. Look in the mirror, make an honest assessment. What worked, what didn't.
That is such great advice. And clearly you've done that in this idea of stretching yourself beyond what you think you can do. I mean, right. When I heard that time and time again today in our conversation about your willingness to kind of push beyond maybe what your barriers of what you thought you were capable of, but you did it anyway. And that is great advice. I remember talking to someone recently who was saying that how do I study leadership? And I gave some similar advice. I recommended some things to read and to listen to. But I said, I bet you there's leadership opportunities around you. Oh, well, yeah, I coach sports. Mm-hmm. That's leadership. And then he came back later and said, hey, guess what? I volunteered to be on the board of our local homeowners association. So now I'm going to be president of the board. He's like, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm going to try it. And I was like, that's perfect. That's exactly, to your point, you learn leadership by doing it. You can study in books, and that helps you, give you some framework, but you learn by doing it. And so great advice. Great advice. So, Candy, thank you so much for your time today. This has been
You're very welcome.
A wonderful conversation. It's great to get to know a little bit more about your leadership journey. Thank you for your service to Penn State and your leadership here of our university and nationally of the whole compliance community.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, David, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you today.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Happy Valley Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Give us a review and share us with others. You can follow us on Twitter at HV Leader Podcast and on YouTube at Happy Valley Leaders Podcast. Remember, leadership is an action and a choice, so go be a leader.